Hey everybody, Mike with Games Played Badly. How much do you know about the Fae world as it pertains to ttrpgs? It's very, very popular right now. There are D&D modules for it. There are different games about it. My next guest has created a game based off of the folklore of Europe. Now, what you'll find is that a lot of the creatures and a lot of the lore behind these creatures are completely different than what D&D or some of these other games have portrayed. And his game is called Fae Earth. Neil is fantastic. He's very knowledgeable. He is well-spoken, well-written, and he's developed a whole D20 game based off this. So it's not a D&D module. It is a completely separate game of his own creation over the last 5 years. He also has a long-term podcast that he's been doing playing this exact game. So they've leveled their characters from level 1 all the way through level 20. So it's pretty impressive. Can't wait to talk to him. Also, I have my Games Play Badly shirt on. I love this shirt. Guess who made this for me? None other than Matt over at Gem Firefly. And if you want a shirt like this, I think you can get this one up there. Or anything like it, all these amazing shirts that he creates that I wear in my videos. Make sure to go up to, oh, wrong side. Go up to gemfirefly.com and put in Badly15, B-A-D-L-Y, 15 at checkout for 15% off your order. As always, I really do appreciate all of you subscribing and following me on Twitter and YouTube and Facebook. We also have a website that's newish and it's right here on the screen. Make sure you check that out. That has links to everything that we're doing, all of our content, and it's the quickest way to find what you're looking for if you're looking for something. I can't wait for you to meet Neil. That interview starts now. Hey Neil, how are you?
I'm not too bad. And yourself?
Oh, I can't complain. The technical difficulties aside, we've had them on both sides today, but
Yeah.
we've gotten through it. The important part is you're here.
Yeah. I'm glad to be here.
Yeah, your game Fae Earth kickstarted, and that's a big deal. And I know it's a little nerve-wracking. But the interesting thing is the Earth in the title, because this is not some faraway world. This is our very own planet here. So why don't you tell me more about your project?
We've been working on it for 5 years now, and one day just randomly, and the thought popped into my head. I was like, what if all of the Fae and the creatures from folklore were real and had always been real, and had always lived just alongside humans? And what would that look like?
Mm-hmm.
And that was it. It was that what if question was where the idea for Fae Earth was born. I mean, gaming for a long while, well, sort of. My first forays into gaming were second edition in the 90s. So, and I played that for about, 6-7 years. Mm-hmm. And then I just stopped gaming for like a good 15, 20 years, and then got back into gaming about, maybe 10 years ago or so. So I'd been back gaming a while when I had the idea for Fae Earth. And I was like, oh, well, and I just started thinking about the idea and like, how would you turn this into a game? And what kind of game would I like it to be? What would make it interesting? You know, because the idea was like, well, what it's about having a setting in which the creatures that we're familiar with the names of were being depicted accurately, because and so many creatures that you get in common pop culture, in whether it's in video games, tabletop, books, whatever, the names are the same, are being used again and again. But when you actually compare the depiction of the creature in popular media and popular culture to how they actually were described in the original folklore, it's often completely different. Mm-hmm. And that was the big thing about Fae Earth, was I wanted to have a game in which the Fae were being accurately and faithfully depicted as they were in the original stories. So then that got me thinking, well, what kind of a setting would you want it in? I was like, well, no, it should be our Earth, but an alternate Earth where things are different, because the Fae have always been around and magic has always existed. And then, like, in what ways would that change history and events and the likes? So that was ultimately where the idea came from. And then I decided I'd make it 19th century because, well, I mean, there's no shortage of pseudo medieval high fantasy games out there. Right. There's plenty of them. And I thought having it in a different time period would just make it that bit more fun and interesting. And like 19th century Victoriana, you can bring steampunk vibes into it. I was like, that
Sure.
is just something that nobody has done. Yes, there have been some great steampunk games and they're great. And yes, there have been examples where they've tried to bring depict the Fae living alongside humans, like say Shadowrun, for example. But
Hmm.
like that's kind of a cyberpunk-esque setting.
Right, right.
No, so nobody ever done it like this before. So that was basically the idea.
So, and this is not a D&D based Roll20 system. It's your own, correct?
No, it's my own D20 system. When I first came up with the idea, I actually was thinking this, oh, how can I make this into a module for fifth edition?
Hmm.
And almost immediately realized I can't. And the reason being, all of the creatures in my game, there are creatures with the same name that already exist in fifth edition. You
Mm.
know, whether you're talking about a dwarf or a goblin or a brownie or a kobold, like these names weren't made up. Like Gygax basically in the 70s got his hands on a book of European folklore and just took a lot of names out of it, but
Hmm.
never actually bothers to then put in creatures that match the descriptions that were in the folklore that he was taking the names from.
Mm.
That was why I said, no, this won't work in fifth edition, because you're going to end up with a module where you've got like dozens and dozens, countless monsters, for lack of a better word, that everybody knows the name of, but in
Hmm.
my setting are going to be completely different to what you're used to. So I decided then I'll make my own system. So I developed my own D20 system, which I'm actually quite proud of myself. I think it's nice. I put a lot of work into it because I'm gonna be honest, this might sound controversial, I might lose some Kickstarter followers. I'm not a massive fan of fifth edition.
Mm.
As a gaming system. Like it's like the legacy is great and all that, but the actual mechanics of the system, how the maths behind it works, I'm not a huge fan of. And I'm also like my job, like I'm not a full-time professional game designer. My full-time profession is I'm a secondary school teacher. I teach
Hmm.
maths and science to teenagers. So I understand maths really well. So when I look at something like any gaming system, but something like fifth edition, and I'm like, as somebody who every day is explaining maths to teenagers who struggle with basic numeracy,
Right.
I was like, this is a horrible system for them. This could be so much more simplified. So that was kind of a big part of what I did with Fair is try to create a more streamlined D20 system,
Hmm.
which I think works quite well. Like in terms of the sheer maths behind it, it's a lot more simple. You got straightforward flat modifiers for everything. And then the action economy in it is a bit more dynamic as well. I was inspired a bit by actually Pathfinder second edition's action economy system, the 3 action rule that they've brought in,
Hmm.
which I really thought was a great idea. So Fair Earth is similar but not quite the same as that. But to be honest with you, look, if you've played any gaming at all, any system, especially if you've played a D20 system, you pick up the mechanics of Fair
Hmm.
in 5 minutes, because it's not like it's completely revolutionized the wheel or anything. It's just another D20 system, very, very similar to the D20 systems that are out there, just with its own fun little quirks to it. Yeah.
Well, that sounds fantastic. I don't mind the idea of a slim down, more workable TTRPG. And from that standpoint, you're right. There are a lot of there are a lot of 5e supplements, and if sounds like you're trying to do something a little bit more unique. So obviously, we don't want people looking at kobolds as these little red dog-like creatures that are half a hit dice and blah blah blah. So you're creating a whole new perception regarding all of the creatures that you're bringing to the table.
I mean, I always give, when people talk to me about it, and they're, especially if they're people who play games like 5e, I always use kobolds as the example, because kobolds come from German folklore, and they were a type of brownie-like creature that would be living in homes and help out with around, and they might do pranks on you if you annoy them and the likes, and they would be normally invisible. And there was this one story from, I think it was from Dusseldorf, I think originally, I could be wrong, of a kobold that lived in the castle of a nobleman, and a young servant boy, a page or something in the castle, tricked the kobold into breaking his invisibility and revealing himself to the page boy. And the kobold became so enraged, he ripped the boy's arm off and beat him to death with it.
Oh, jeez.
Yeah. That is what kobolds were actually about. They weren't little dragon guys worshipping big dragons with 2 hit points getting squashed by adventurers. That's what the OG kobold was. So this is, that is why I had to decide to make it my own unique systems. Like, I couldn't have it as a module for something like Shadowrun or Pathfinder or 5th edition or anything. I was just like, it just won't work because, as I said, like, these creatures' names have already been around forever, but I'm basing it on the original folklore, so they're completely different. Completely different. In fact, that was a big challenge for me in the early stages of designing the game, because if you have a fairy and you have a fairy with the abilities that fairies actually had in the original European stories, a single fairy could TPK a party of players on their own if they're like 5th level or lower. You know, so it was like, well, how do you then deal with that? So one of the things that I did was every magical creature in the system comes with 3 stat blocks, a young, adult, and ancient version of the creature, so that you've got, with the young version, they have some of the abilities that we read about in the tales, but not all of them. And if you come, by the time you get to the ancient one, they're the ones that have all of the abilities that we hear about in stories and in folklore, and they're the really scary, powerful ones. Which then means that while if you open up my book, it looks like there's not as many magical creatures in it as you would normally expect. There's actually 3 times the number of stat blocks. Now, part of the reason why there's not as many magical creatures, though, is because another thing I found in my research was that you quite often have the situation where you have essentially the same or a nearly identical type of fairy or fae creature in different regions across Europe with completely different names. But they are like, but they have the exact same abilities. They behave in the exact same way. They interact with humans like a brownie. Brownie is was the name of a fairy that would live in the Highland in Scotland. You travel 100 kilometers south, and you're in the north of England. It was called a hobgoblin. The word hobgoblin refers to brownies in places like Yorkshire, but in Yorkshire they weren't called brownies; they were called hobgoblins. You go further south again, and it's a pixie. You go across to, say, Switzerland and places like that, and it's a Heinzelmännchen. In Germany, it's a kobold. So you've got a lot of the creatures in the system, in their descriptions, I might have 5 or 6 different names for the creature, or there might be regional variations on the creature. So, like, a big thing that people talk about a lot in popular culture is how fairies and the fae are vulnerable to iron. That's a very common story. That only appears in Irish and Scottish folklore. Nowhere else in European folklore, anyway, do you hear of fairies and magical creatures being vulnerable to iron. It's exclusively found in Irish and Scottish folklore. So then that creates a situation where if you're playing a bunch of adventurers and you've been in Ireland and then you go to France and then you meet a fairy, you're like, I know what will wreck them. And you take out a piece of iron and looking at what's that? Because this isn't an Irish fairy, this is a French fairy. They're looking at you like an idiot. You're like, what's that's got to do to me? I'm supposed to be scared now. So like that's like where you get these, and of course from a GM's perspective, it actually makes for a really fun situation where you could have your players fighting or facing, not necessarily fighting, but just encountering the same type of magical creature again and again, but each time you're throwing different abilities at them. Because the first one they met was really, really young. And then the second one they met was that bit older, or they met a cousin of them in a different region that has slightly different vulnerabilities and slightly different magical abilities. And so what that means then is that your players can never assume, oh, we got this, we faced one of these before, we got this down, we know what's going to be. It makes for some really fun and interesting situations and encounters that there's nothing more enjoyable for me as a GM than my players underestimating the situation they just walked into and thinking, oh, we've got this nailed, we're going to be fine. And then it's like, wait, they couldn't do that the last time. Oh, crap.
Well, I mean, but I think you bring another completely different dynamic is that these creatures exist and they live in the same world as humans do, and there is a coexistence there.
Yeah.
Now you talk about humans that have fey blood who are considered outsiders as well. So I mean, it sounds like rather than there necessarily being a physical fight, there might be more of a role play struggle between some of these various races or sects together.
Yeah, and that's what, like, obviously I wanted to try and create a system whereby you've got lots of different choices and things you can do. I
Hmm.
still feel like I could have put more work into the RP social mechanics of the game, but if you really want great RP social mechanics, then you want a TTRPG that's all about the RP, like say Vampire the Masquerade, which I think is some of the best social mechanics. Like in Vampire the Masquerade, when you end up in a fight, that's because things went bad. Because you get messed up really fast in a fight in that system. The whole point is don't get to that stage. So I have tried to have the mix of the two. And the other thing is actually the fact that there's none of the creatures in the system are inherently evil in that really old-fashioned trope of the evil races. They might do things that would be considered evil, but then the other ones will do things that are good because they're like humans. Some of them are assholes. Some of them are
Sure.
really cool. And it's no different in that regard. And you do end up in situations where if your first instinct as a player is to automatically reach for your gun or your saber, you're probably going to be in a lot of trouble. Now that's not to say that the system doesn't have combat in it. You do have combat in the game, and as you go up in levels, because it is a level-based system, you do then get the ability to be kind of holding your own against these creatures. So you do still have that, but there is also the side of it with the social side of it. One actual mechanic that I have in the system, which is a unique mechanic, is I have a thing called feats, of which there are three types: combat feats, magic feats, and social feats. And the idea behind the feats was how in the stories you'd have the hero would have some signature move they could do with their sword, or
Mhm.
some special maneuver. So that's the idea of the feat. So you train in a feat, and it's an additional thing you do as part of an action. So the combat feats, you use your major action to attack, and you'd spend a minor action to attempt a feat. And it might be, oh, I get an extra attack, or I do an extra damage die, or maybe I disarm, or whatever it is.
Mhm.
And then you've got other similar ones from magic to augment your spells. But then there's the social feats. So you can be really adept at things like, you could be someone with a real silver tongue who you don't just win the persuasion roll, but you actively convince the NPCs to do something that would help you beyond what they would normally do, or you're exceptionally good at deceiving or rallying the crowd or whatever. Like there's different, as I say, there's the different feat mechanics in it. So that was something I wanted to bring in to the system, which is a lot of fun, that gives you these extra special maneuvers or special abilities that you can use, which then gives you more choice in what you're doing. Like especially in combat, the way the system works is you've got your major action, which is your action, and then you've got your two minor actions. And your minor actions could be anything from moving to swapping out a weapon to using a feat. But if you decide that you're not going to move, oh, and also you might save a minor action for a reaction. Okay, so
Mm.
let's say you're a spellcaster, you might save one of your minor actions so you can use a counter spell. Or as
Mm.
a soldier, you might save a minor action so you can parry an attack. But what this means is that if you're choosing, okay, this turn I'm not going to move, well, you
Mhm.
haven't wasted an action. You've still got an unspent minor action that you can now use for something else,
Mhm.
whether that is saving it for a reaction or using it to use a feat with a major action that you were carrying out. So you've got a lot more choice, and action economy in the system is actually quite dynamic in that respect, which I worked a lot on, and I'm really proud of how, like, in playtesting, how it's worked out.
Very good. Yeah, I mean, it's 5 years is a long time.
Yeah, no. And actually, it's funny, 2 days ago, we finished the final climactic battle of our campaign one. It was the final battle against the BBEG,
Mhm.
and we finished our actual 5-year campaign 2 days ago,
Oh,
um,
wow.
having played from first to 20th level.
Jeez.
Yeah, it was a lot of emotions, and it was great. I don't want to give too many spoilers. All I'll say is they didn't all die.
They didn't all die.
Yeah, they were. It was like it was I've never like it was the final battle was they were trying to stop an ancient god from Irish mythology from being released from his chains. So they were fighting an army of his corrupted fae and cult followers on one side, and then there was this campaign was set in Ireland in the 1840s. So you had the Irish army on the other side, and then the players battling their way across the battlefield to get to the center where the ritual was occurring to try to stop the ritual to release this god Crom Cruach, who is an actual god from Irish mythology. Not a lot is known about him, but there are stories that associate him with things like human sacrifice and that. We don't know entirely if he was involved in that because the stories are written by Christian monks. So that's Irish mythology for you. Like the myths that we have that survived because the monks wrote them down. And they'd been passed on in the oral tradition for hundreds of years. But they weren't ever written down. And then the monks started writing them down. So you do sometimes when you're reading some of the myths can see where they took creative license, where they changed things slightly to give it a more Christian basis. Sometimes it'll be subtle things, sometimes it'll be very explicit things. But so as I said, on Sunday we had our last session, and we have a podcast too, and that'll be I'm working on currently episode 88. Episode 90 will probably be the final. So in about maybe 2 weeks, a week and a half, 2 weeks, we'll have the last episode of campaign 1 will go up. But so as I said, like when I first started working on this system 5 years ago, within 3 months of having the bare basic bones of it, I put together a group with my wife and friends, and we just play tested through 20 levels of character development.
Wow.
Fine tuning and honing the system, the mechanics, everything. And like I did change things over time. And like when we started, I said to one of my players, like, the system might be very different by the time we finish to what it is now. And I did make changes, not huge fundamental changes, but over time, tweaking things, which was a great thing to be able to do. Like, because one of the challenges that you have as a ttrpg designer and creator is playtesting. It can be so difficult to find people who are the time and the experience and are willing to play test your game for you. So it's been great to be able to say, well, actually, even like it's not I've ran games of Fae Earth with other groups, either one-shots at cons, but also other small groups over small periods as well. But to be able to say, no, this has been pretty well run through now, gone through the full spectrum from first to 20th level. Because it's funny, because I put up a cheeky tweet there the other day saying how, like, there's an article from D&D Beyond, I think about a year and a half ago. They were looking at their user data, and they found that only 2% of users actually have 20th level characters on the D&D platform. And I was like, so the fact that we played from first to 20th level, does that mean we're better than everyone?
Well, I mean, I think there is multiple reasons why that is. And I'm impressed that you did that, especially within your own gaming system, because that kind of, I wouldn't say bulletproofs it, but it lends credence to the fact that things work because you work through them. But I know from my standpoint, a lot of times we didn't make it that far because people just got bored after a while and they wanted to try something different. Because getting to level 20 is, again, maybe a 5-year adventure, real life. So kudos for you guys doing that.
Oh yeah, no, absolutely. Like, getting bored and being like, let's try a new system is a really valid reason. But then you've got the other basics of people get older, people finish secondary school, they start university, they get married, they have kids, they move jobs, they move cities. It's like life gets in the way of having the fun.
Oh yeah.
And the players that I had at the start are not all the players that finished. Well, 3 of them are actually.
Yeah.
Of the original 4 players, one of them had to leave the game about a year and a half into because of work, and then came back about 12 months later. And then another player had left as well. And then I had a few other players who came in and out. So in like 2 of my players have been there from the start all the way to the end. And then one of my players, she joined the campaign 2 years ago, and then the other Neve, she started and then left and then returned. So it was like, as I said, it's a lot like when we finished and I went around the table and I was asking them each to give me their characters' epilogues, there was not a dry eye in the house. Because
You asked for the characters, you dirty dog.
but like this is like we've been telling a story with these characters for
Sure.
so long. They're real people. They had their own backstories. They had their own hopes, their own dreams, they had their relationships. So like it still hasn't fully sunk into me that story is over. And even for me, it's emotional because I'm the GM, but I'm a player at the table too. That was
Sure.
my story as well. But that is one of the things that I do love about the game. I do feel it gives you a chance to have really rich stories because there's so much in the setting that you can work with. You can be having an urban campaign. You could be doing the mystery and the investigation type stuff. You can be out in the wilderness just randomly helping local villagers whose children were stolen by the fairies or whatever, or some giants in the hills have started harassing the townsfolk. And then you've got your dungeon crawl side of things where you're maybe exploring abandoned hollow hills that fairies once lived in and that they've left behind, or actually one of the things in the setting, and this is where the alternate history comes into it. So the geography of Europe in Fae is slightly different. There's two Fae nations in the world. There's the kingdom of Jotunheim, which is basically the northern Arctic regions of Scandinavia. So Norway, Sweden, Finland, and also Siberia. And that area is filled with your frost giants, your trolls, your dwarves, Kuldra, different Fae creatures like that, okay? And then in the middle, like of Western Europe, kind of in the region that would, in our world, be the Black Forest region of Germany, so the western section of Germany, the eastern Alsace-Lorraine region of France, and then the Austrian Alps and a chunk of Switzerland. That whole section there is the other Fae nation of Arcadia. And they're like two super powerful Fae kingdoms because, well, like anytime humans had ever had a conflict with them on the battlefield, it would get destroyed by the Fae armies. You're fighting an army and their heavy infantry are giants and ogres. Their cavalry are centaurs. Their pikemen and riflemen are dwarves. You're not going to win that fight. But I've had fun with alternate histories. So I was like, well, how would the French Revolution have impacted on things? And I was like, well, the elven nobility of France were really decadent, and the other elven nobility around Europe used to look down and like, you guys are just, you are spending too much time with the humans. You're spending too much time partying them. Half of you have kids with them. You're not focused on your magics and all the rest of that. So then when the French Revolution happened and the human nobility was attacked, the human mobs then attacked the elven nobility and drove them out of France. So in my setting in France, there are abandoned elven palaces dotted around the country. And sometimes adventurers decide we're going to go in and get the treasure. And when they do, they almost never return. Because while the elves are gone, their magic is still there, their traps are still there, and other Fae that lived in those palaces still live in those palaces. So you've got this kind of fun stuff. You've also got the fact, as you mentioned, in the system, I have two lineages. You've got your standard boring humans, and then you've got a variant human that are called the Fae Touched. And the Fae Touched is simply somebody who, somewhere in your family tree, someone had a fun time with a Fae creature, okay? So you have Fae blood in your family, all right? And it will always be visible. You can't pass as Fae Touched. There'll always be some physical indicator showing your Fae lineage, okay? The way the magic in the system works is you have to be born with the arcane spark. You can't go and study magic. You have to be born with an innate magical ability. All Fae Touched are born with the arcane spark because of their Fae blood. Some non-Fae blooded humans are also born with magic, but it's really rare. And in Europe, it's even rarer again than in other parts of the world, because what they noticed was after about the 16th century, there was a sudden massive drop in the number of humans without Fae blood born with magic, which happened to coincide with the witch persecutions that were across Europe, where tens of thousands, possibly, we don't know exactly, some figures quote even maybe 100,000 or more people were executed on the crime of witchcraft. And in my setting in Europe, there is a noticeable drop in the number of humans that are born with magic. When you compare that to places like Africa or Asia or the Americas, where you didn't have those persecutions happening on that large scale systemic level, they have more people with magic in the world. So that creates this other, although the other fun thing is that the Fae touched in the setting of we're always kind of slightly viewed as outsiders, not fully trusted by society. It would depend on where you were. Like if you were living in a major city like London or Berlin, you could get lost in the city, you know. If you were living in a small rural village, but your family went back 5-6 generations, no one cares what your Fae touch because you're a local. Because that's how rural villages are. Oh, they're 5 generations, they count. They're only 2 generations. Oh, they're a blow-in. They're only new to the area. So, but in the setting, because there's been this growth of magitech, so mixing of industry science and magic in the world, and as a result of that, artificers who are trained in developing magitech, because they're becoming busier and busier, because industrialists are saying, hey, could you make an engine that runs off magic? Could you make a furnace that runs off magic? So I'm not having to buy coke and coal for my smelting. You know, they're now finding that they're struggling to get apprentices. So they're now actively recruiting from the Fae Touch communities, because all Fae Touch are born with the arcane spark. So now the Fae Touch are suddenly finding themselves in this unique position that they've never had before, where they're still viewed by many as outsiders, but they are outsiders that have this essential and integral skill that is essential for society, and the overwhelming majority of people don't have. So then that creates a really fun and interesting dynamic and potential conflict for you in your narrative. If you want to play a Fae Touch, you can have a lot of fun with that, of how your background worked and how you're being treated in society and how you interact with society. So like, as I said, like a big part of the world that I've created, as I said, is like this change of, as you said, like you've got Fae living alongside humans, and what changes does that bring in? And like, it does bring in conflict, but not in the sense of combat and violence, but just in terms of conflicting opinions, conflicting ideals, conflicting peoples. And that's where the best stories are driven by conflict. So like, that's the whole point of it. And I really try to do that, but using folklore as the basis for it.
Yeah, just being a DM myself, I just think about that environment and all the fun stuff that I could create, and all the fun stuff that the players can create to make it even more interesting. So that sounds like a lot of fun.
Yeah. So as I said, like, Kickstarter just launched. I'm apprehensive about it, of course. Hopefully,
Everybody is.
Yeah, it is a challenge. So like, if it was a 5th edition supplement, Feywild modules are some of the best-selling modules on Drive-Thru-RPG. Everybody loves adventures with the Fae, and it's like, if I had made this in 5e, I would have launched a Kickstarter 3 years ago, and it would have been funded in probably 48 hours. But at the same time, I'm still proud of what I've created, and it isn't like, I think it's a fun Kickstarter, and there's a lot of scope in it. Like, I've tried to create a range of price tiers in it. You know, for 20 euros you get the PDF of the core rulebook. For 30 euros you get that and a starter adventure for levels 1 to 5. So if you get the 2 of them, you can immediately start playing again. You've got a starter adventure with pre-generated characters. You can immediately start playing. Then for 40 euros you get all that plus the hardback, and then for 50 euros you could get all that plus a nice set of dice as well. And because everybody loves the dice, and we have we do have some really good stretch goals. The first couple of tiers are just like, if the funding goal is 25,000 euros. If we had 30,000 euros, then that extra 5 grand is just going to pay for more art. And then if we get into higher tiers, that will be paying for things like being able to do more research, because the game is based on folklore. Every single creature in the game, with the exception of a tiny handful, comes directly from folklore. I've had 1 or 2 creatures that I made up in the game, and that was for like mechanical reasons and stuff. It was like, part of it was just, well, if you players want to have a fight with something. I need to create something that won't wipe them out.
Right.
So like that was because, as I said, like even the most diminutive fairy in, and not just in Irish folklore, but in any European folklore, a tiny little Tinkerbell could kick your ass. So I've got a few simple creatures that I made myself. The magic in the game. One of the spellcasters in the system is the witch, and the witches are unique in that they have access to certain spells that none of the other casters have access to, and called the ritual spells. They're the only spells that have material components in them, but every spell that they have access to, I can point you to either an archaeological example or a historically documented example from European folk magic of that specific thing. So this is not spells that I've made up. This was actually researching surviving examples from European folk magic, whether it's objects that are in museums, whether it's academic articles. I've read a lot of academic folklore articles, a lot. You know, like my light reading was an English translation of the first edition Brothers Grimm. But so that's for some stretch goal. And then the big stretch goal that we have, and this is why I want to talk about it, because like if people want to jump on and support us, if we manage to hit 50,000, which is a huge sum of money, but if we do, I have a Slavic folklorist who is going to work on the project. Currently, the setting only is in Western Europe. Doesn't go any further east in Germany. But if we get to the 50,000 euro stretch goal, I actually have a Slavic folklorist who's going to come onto the project, and we will expand it out eastwards and incorporate the folklore of the Slavic regions of Central and Eastern Europe into it, because Slavic folklore is enormous. Like it's some of the richest folklore that has survived in Europe. And as I said, I'm not a folklorist. My day job, I teach maths and science. So the folklore that I know is either folklore, Irish folklore I know because I'm Irish and I've always been interested in folklore, or else it's Western European folklore that I've studied. So it was very much a case of, as much as I would love to bring Slavic folklore into it, because you got incredible figures in Slavic folklore, unbelievable. Like the obvious one that everybody knows and loves is Baba Yaga, but on her, I can't learn Slavic folklore. That's a university degree in and of itself. So that's where we've got our really fun and exciting ideas for stretch goals as well. So
that'd be awesome. I think you're taking a kind of established ttrpg tropes and turning that all on its ear. So I'm really interested to see what comes out of this. I'll be following the Kickstarter pretty closely to see exactly what's happening, and maybe we can chat again after the Kickstarter and see how everything went and where you're going from there.
No, that'd be great. If people are interested and would like to see what it's like, I do have a YouTube channel. It has about 3 videos on it. Just fair. But I actually have had a chance to run a couple of one-shots with some friends, and we recorded it and uploaded it. So you can actually, there's 3 videos up, 3 one-shots. One that's set in Bavaria, one in Wales, and one in Italy. So if you wanted to actually have get an idea of what is, and each of the one shots, they're not too crazy long. I think they were about 2.5 hours, I think, each one. So I like, even with my podcast series, which is like on Spotify and Apple, iTunes, and all the rest of them, like I very much tried to keep those episodes to 60 minutes to the hour, because I personally think 60 minutes is the perfect length for a podcast. That is your that's your commute to work. That's your work. That's your workout in the gym, your lunch break. That's your walking the dog in the evening. It's a really good. I think I did the maths, and I think I was actually averaging 71 minutes. But I tried to keep it to 60 minutes. But for people who wanted to get a feel for, if you are interested in the Kickstarter, I'd like to know more, check out definitely some of our fun little one-shots that we've had. Couple of hours, a lot shorter than some of the actual plays that are out there.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I will have links to everything that we're talking about down below. I'll have links to the YouTube stuff, to the podcast, to the Kickstarter, and that way you get a chance to see Neil in action And I think this is a fantastic idea. I'm really, really curious about it myself. And I can't wait to see what happens with the Kickstarter. Thanks again for coming on, and I really appreciate your time. And I wish you the absolute best of luck.
Thanks, Mike.
Thank you.